Okay, this is about life in the 1950s. Now, the first thing is the so-called drug problem. The drug problem for us as high school kids in the 50s, middle class kids, just didn't exist. What we'd heard about was that musicians, and basically only musicians, took drugs. There was poor old Billie Holiday, who was a known heroin addict. She'd been to jail a few times, and everybody loved her songs. But drugs just were not something that kids, middle class kids, had any exposure to. There was no such thing, and it was a big comedy that there was a movie that came out at that time called Reefer Madness. Now, you can still get that movie on the internet, and I think you'll get a few laughs from it. But how the government could think that this would dissuade anybody from drugs is a little bit crazy, because it's pure fiction. Okay, so there was no drug problem. Now, how about the other big problem we hear about all the time is massacres? People with guns, automatic weapons, start shooting into crowds, and hundreds of people get killed or injured. That just never happened in the 50s. And the funny thing was, after World War II, veterans got discharged, and they were able to take home their weapons. I don't think Browning automatic machine guns, no, but plenty of rifles were in people's homes, and plenty of handguns, and there just were no mass shootings. I don't know why. That seems to have come 50 years later. But the same is true in Switzerland today. Every home has a rifle, a military grade, actually automatic rifle, but they're all kept under lock and key, and I'm sure that a very enterprising young teenager could get the key and take it and start shooting people, but in Switzerland they just don't. I don't know, what the solution is, but it doesn't seem to be banning guns makes the big difference, because there are plenty of people that have guns where they don't go out shooting into crowds. Okay, now let me talk more about what life was like in the 1950s. First of all, the air was much worse than it is now. I remember going out and coughing a lot in the morning. Why? Because during the winter months, coal heat was what everybody had in their house. There were people in the janitors union who would shovel heat into your furnace that was in the bottom of your house, and almost everybody had coal heat. And during the 50s and 60s, there was a transition to like diesel fuel. They call that in Europe mazout, but it was diesel fuel and natural gas, which was much less labor intensive and must have been much less polluting, because I didn't have that cough all the time. So another thing that I bet you guys just don't know about or think about is that prior to 1950, and a lot prior, maybe in the 20s, what was common in homes was gas lighting. As I grew up, we had what they call a Coleman lantern. It had a mantle, and it had gas, and you pumped up the gas and you lit the mantle, and it gave you quite a bright incandescent light. But the thing is that in many homes, we still had gas lighting and gas fixtures, and they were gradually replaced by electric lights. And we heard that in the country, in smaller towns, electrification after World War II was a big thing. So people don't realize that everybody having electricity and electric lights and electric heaters and radiators, that just didn't exist in the 50s. Well, here's a story maybe in the 50s, I had a ride to a funeral. And I went in a Cadillac limousine. Now, for a little kid to ride, a middle-class kid to ride in a Cadillac, Cadillac was then kind of like Rolls-Royce. Only the upper echelons would have one. But I remember in this Cadillac, there was no, rotary wind-up window. There was a button, and you press the button, and the window went down, and so I was, a young kid, maybe preteen, and I just had a wonderful time putting that window up and down. And I said to my dad, "Hey, could we get a car with an automatic window?" And he said, "Hey, the more gadgets and more stuff that's on a car, the more there is to go wrong." And of course now, 75 years later, you can't even find a wind-up window anymore. Everybody has automatic windows. And sure enough, our automatic window broke, and we had to take the car apart and the door and fix it ourselves, because we don't believe in spending money. Okay, so let me talk about another thing. Today we call where the black people live, like a slum, we call that a ghetto. But in the 50s, ghetto was not a kind of a bad word. We used it interchangeably with neighborhood. And nobody really felt oppressed living in a ethnic neighborhood. In fact, that word ethnic didn't come along for another 20 or 30 years. But when I grew up, there was a Chinese neighborhood, Polish neighborhood, Jewish neighborhood. I remember we would go to the Jewish neighborhood to get a lox and bagel and cream cheese sandwich. And the name of the restaurant was Ashkenaz. I didn't learn till much later that Ashkenaz was a kind of a European Jewish person. But the Chinese neighborhood restaurant was Wing Wo. And the Greek restaurant was, I don't know, it might have been called the Athens. The Italian restaurant was the Milano. And the Polish restaurant was the Warsaw. And the German restaurant, that was my absolute favorite. That was called the Deutsche Ecke, which I knew German at the time, I still do. And it was called the German Corner. And we even had a Russian neighborhood, and I remember going to the restaurant there called the Red Star. So, and then finally, the black neighborhoods, well, all the other neighborhoods were very welcoming. If you were a tourist and you went to the local ethnic restaurant, nobody threatened you or anything. But the black neighborhoods didn't seem to have soul food restaurants in those days. But when I finally moved to New York, boy, that was Harlem was great. Harlem was a place where I think it was called the Cotton Club, and that's where white people went, and the entertainers there were something else. Really, the first-class singers and dancers and musicians. And Harlem had a lot of restaurants and clubs, but other cities in the black neighborhoods, they just didn't have anything like that. I don't know if people in these neighborhoods felt oppressed. I lived in an Italian neighborhood. Remember I told you about how I almost became a mafia boss, because even though I wasn't Italian, I had an Italian girlfriend. Platonic, of course, and when you're a young kid. And nobody felt oppressed. Nobody felt forced to live in their Italian or German neighborhood. Or I didn't know many black people in those days, but I do remember the official word for black people was, nobody said black. That would be like an insult. But Negro was the word. And if you use the word Negro, that people would say, "Oh, you're hoity-toity." Hoity-toity meant you're putting on airs, because what everybody called black people was colored people. And I don't know what black people called each other in those days, but there was kind of a line. The blacks and the whites, usually there was a street, and on one side of the street was black people, and the other side was, in our case, Italians. And we didn't go in each other's neighborhoods much. And if you did, you were likely to be challenged as a young kid by a gang member. Hey, whose gang are you in? And, well, oh, by the way, there was no real assaults. I guess there was a funny musical play later on. It was a West Side Story, where it pitted one group of Puerto Ricans against another group. But actually, in my day, in Chicago, where I was as a teenager, we didn't have any real gang fights. Okay. By the way, there were absolutely no Arabs and no Muslims that we ever encountered, and no Arab restaurants. They just didn't exist at all. Okay. So, as I say, nobody felt oppressed, or and by the way, we said, hey, I live in an Italian ghetto, big deal. So it was just like a neighborhood. So there was a difference, quite a difference of life in the 50s between then and now. But I think, most people were happy. There were very few suicides. And, well, have things gotten better or worse? I don't know. Just different. That's all. Just different.